like to know, the recording is available for free to the public. This is part of a special program with the OHP, and anybody who would like to watch the recording, it'll be available on our website at news.californiapreservation.org at the registration page that you use to register for this event. And feel free to email me if you'd like a link to the recording later. I'm happy to send that to you. I wanted to welcome everybody to this second part of the quarterly SHPO series, the State Office of Historic Preservation. This program is made possible by the coordination and planning of OHP staff and CPF, and it is being offered for free to all members of the general public interested in historic preservation issues in California. Before beginning, I would like to encourage you to become a member of the California Preservation Foundation. For as little as $40, you will have discounted access to over 20 webinar programs, upcoming members-only advocacy forums, a dozen workshops held at historic locations across the state, our 2015 conference at the Historic Naval Training Center in San Diego, and our annual Preservation Design Awards and dinner. Information on membership can be found on our website at californiapreservation.org. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. We will close with a short question and answer period. And if you'd like to know, on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen is a Q&A box. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the Q&A box, and we will hold that question until it can be addressed by a speaker. There is also a chat box right above the Q&A box, and that is visible to all participants. So if you would like to comment or interject, you may do so through the chat box as well. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of the screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time in the presentation. This will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, you will need to type your question or response in the chat box. I'm now going to introduce our speakers for today. William Berg is a state historian for the California Office of Historic Preservation, and Jay Correa currently supervises the National Register program of the Office of Historic Preservation. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. The two speakers will cover the process of getting listed on the National Register, and I believe Jay is beginning the presentation. If I'm mistaken, let me know, but we're now ready to begin, and feel free to start.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to cover the National Register fairly quickly and in my introduction, and then turn it over to William Berg, and then I'll be back on to conclude. The National Register is the nation's inventory of historic places and the national repository of documentation on the variety of historic property types, significance, abundance, condition, ownership, and other information. I routinely tell people often in an effort to dispel any notion that the National Register will affect land use authority, I often tell folks that at its most basic level, the National Register is in some ways nothing more than a list of properties that deserve to be protected. It would be interesting to look at some rough numbers. Well, before rough numbers, the state of California is, but that slide went. But I'll just say that the numbers of properties listed in California by National Register nominations is approximately 2,600 or 2,600 nominations. If you include all the district properties that are nominated in some of those nominations, there are about 10,000 properties listed on the National Register in California. To go back one more slide, I apologize for this, but the National Register bulletins are critical to understanding the program. It would be impossible to prepare a nomination without really reading and completely understanding National Register Bulletin 15 and 16A, and they are available online. It's actually quite difficult to get a hold of hard copies these days. Bulletin 15 covers the philosophical underpinnings of the program. It's the Bible of the program. It explains criteria for listing. Sections in the bulletin include property types. Is a good explanation of historical significance, historical context, and also historical integrity. And I will some of those items in greater detail in just a moment. Bulletin 16A is the how-to bulletin. It's the document that explains how to complete the form. I've always found it slightly amusing that the bulletin that explains how to fill out the form is significantly larger than Bulletin 15 that explains the criteria. So, but that indication of how technical completing the application is, and in fact, William's portion of the discussion will zero in on some of those technical issues. I often like to joke that we are like the IRS, except it's history and not income taxes. So, back to the historic context slide. Historic context is critical. It's all important in preparing a National Register nomination. This is because the National Register requires that a historic property be discussed within a historic context. In this way, the property can be shown to be linked to or significant within the broader patterns of our history. Personally, I like to think that context serves as a great unit. It unites the way that a resource and we as a people share a common history and a common bond. Just a few examples. Lighthouse on the upper left corner. It would not be enough to just describe the history of this building in a National Register nomination. One would have to talk a bit about the history of navigation in general. Briefly, we're not for a huge document. You would have to then narrow down and discuss maybe the history of navigation on the West Coast. And in that way, put into context the importance of a lighthouse like this one pictured. The same way, the large Italianate with Second Empire Man's roof on the right-hand side, you would have to not just describe its architectural style, but give a little bit of background on the style and the history of it. And the history of its occurrence in California and San Francisco. And likewise, the Masonic Lodge in the lower left-hand corner. It would not be enough to just describe a chronology of the history of the building. You'd have a little bit of description of the importance of the Masons in the social and cultural, in this case, the town of Vallejo. So again, context is very critical. It's probably the most difficult aspect of a nomination that folks wrestle with. So, Bulletin 15 also, most importantly, discusses the criteria for evaluation. Criterion A is event, and this is very brief. Criterion B is association with important person. These are the ways properties can be significant for National Register purpose. Criterion C is architecture, and criterion D is information and is really concerned with archaeology. So, in National Register Bulletin 15, you'll find a good list of categories of properties. And I'm also going to use this section to show some nice slides of the types of properties we often deal with at OHP. So I'm also going to, you'll see that there are more slides, structures, and that's because I think that there is a little bit of confusion about when a structure is a structure as opposed to a building. So this is a great example of, and easy enough, of a building. A building shelters any form of human activity for the purposes of the National Register. Here's another example of a building. A barn near San Luis Obispo, just outside of San Luis Obispo. And then again to structure. Right? I mean, although you could argue that some structures can house a person, they're primarily functional in nature. So we have a bridge, a water tower, and then the same lighthouse we were speaking of earlier. So, technically, these buildings are for purposes other than creating human shelter. They're functional constructions according to the National Register. Another wonderful example of a structure. Although people live, they are considered structures for National Register purposes. I don't have an example of a object, of an object. We get very few object nominations. I can't think of a single one, actually, in the last 5 or 7 years. They do frequently become contributors to large districts, though. So a good example of an object would be a water fountain in a designed landscape. And then the slide that's up right now, of course, is just another example of going back to structure, a freeway. Here's another property type, a site, primarily archaeological in nature. Although we will, well, even a battlefield site would be primarily archaeological in nature. Although it could be, a battlefield site could be eligible under Criterion A for its association with the battle that took place there. And then finally, the final category of property is a district. This is a shot of a very large, nearly 400 property district in San Francisco. National Register Bulletin 15 critically discusses the 7 aspects of historical integrity. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I think it's just important that we all at least see the 7 aspects: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. I think for today's purposes, it's important to note that I think out in the world, outside of OHP, folks frequently think that a building must retain perfect integrity to be eligible for the National Register. So today I just want to convey that that's not necessarily true. You could add this building is somewhat modernized, but it still retains the basic shape and form of what it was. And importantly, the interior retains fairly high integrity, and this building is very significant for the activities that took place on the inside. And just for fun, I'll let everyone know this is where Leo Fender did most of his inventing: the electric guitar, the bass guitar, his amplifiers. And then most critically, we should always remember that integrity is not dependent on condition. So I put up one of the more humorous slides I've received in the last few years. It shows a building in very poor condition. One could argue that this building still retains most of its integrity, although this wasn't a National Register nomination. Another important issue to remember is that integrity requirements are not the same across all National Register criteria. So if you are nominating a property because of its architecture under National Register Criterion C, it's expected that it's going to require a higher level of integrity. After all, we're nominating it because it embodies the distinct characteristics of a type. Under Criterion A, integrity is not as critical. The resource just has to be identifiable as the place where the important event took place. So I'll conclude my portion of the beginning of the webinar and turn it over to William Burke.
All right, Thank you, Jay. We're moving on now from theory to practice, and a lot of nominating the property is filling out the form. And like any government form, it expects a certain level of bureaucratic language. And part of our job here at OHP is to help people translate history into that bureaucratic language. The first thing to keep in mind is to ensure that you're using the latest version of the NPS 10900 form and the latest checklist, which will include the latest requirements. I'll show you where to find them on our website shortly, but they're updated every 3 years, and we definitely ask everyone to use the most recent forms. NPS has started to have some concerns over people submitting nominations on very old forms. It's about substance over style. This is in many ways a bureaucratic document. Many of us who are more used to a more flowery style of writing or historic interpretation can find it difficult to sort of tone it down a little bit in order to have the nomination address what needs to be there in substance without putting too much flavor to the text. You want to make it readable and interesting to the reader, but you don't want to include a lot of unnecessary information and make it read like a bureaucratic document. It should be structured as such as well, which can interfere with narrative style, but can make the nomination much more comprehensible to a reviewer. Take a look at other nominations for ideas. I'll show you where to find that too. Our office can provide technical assistance if you have specific things that you need to know about how to fill out the nomination or specific questions, but we don't really get into the issue of whether or not the property is eligible or whether your historic context hangs together until the nomination is submitted. And if you're 90% sure, if you're partially sure, but not completely, go ahead and submit. If we have an issue, if there are things that need to be addressed, we will send an RFI letter. And it's very important to understand the RFI letter is not a rejection letter. We're not returning your nomination. We're not rejecting it. We're saying in order for the nomination to be processed, there are issues that need to be addressed. Maybe there are components missing. Maybe there's information that would benefit the nomination. The property appears to be eligible, but the case isn't made in the narrative. And you, as the subject matter expert, are the ones who can best make the case to us and then through us to National Park Service in DC why this property is significant, what makes it important to your community. It's obvious to someone who's in your community and knows the story, but telling the story to a third party who's never seen the property and probably never will, that's another matter. And one other item would the nomination documents or Word documents don't insert pictures or illustrations into the nomination text. They should be separate. Part of that is because NPS uses optical character recognition to scan the nominations, and if there's pictures, it can interfere with the OCR software. This is our registration unit homepage. The last slide in the presentation will include the link. That's ohp.parks.ca.gov, a right slash and the word registration. There are always two parts of this page I point people towards. Number one is the National Register of Historic Places link, which is on that bullet list to the left, and the second is the Actions Taken page, which is the red box on the right. This is the National Register page, and if you scroll down on that page, the right-hand side contains the nomination packet. The two bulletins that Jay mentioned earlier, Bulletin 15 and 16A, are downloadable in PDF format, as well as the checklist. The checklist is specific to California and includes all the information that is needed in the nomination that should accompany the nomination forms. If you scroll down a little farther on that page, you'll find specifications for National Register photos and also a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet if you're submitting a district or other property that has multiple owners, and you use the Excel spreadsheet rather than the single sheet, rather than the single cover letter to list all of the owners of a district property. This is the Actions Taken page. There's one for every year, dating back to 2009. You can scroll through year by year and take a look at every property that the State Historical Resources Commission has reviewed. National Register, California Historical Landmarks, etc. If you click on the name of the nomination, and the nomination names typically here, it'll open up a PDF with the entire nominating document. And to the left is typically only one photo. In some cases, it'll include multiple photos. Those are your best guides because these are recently approved nominations that have passed staff muster. They may not be in their final form. In some cases, there's editing after review, but they will give you the best sense of what a completed nomination looks like, how long it should be, what issues it addresses, how it's structured, and please use them as guides. A lot of people have used these nominations as the bones for new nominations. The checklist, as I mentioned, the first thing in the nomination packet should be a cover letter with information to contact the owner. If there's a single owner, you can put that owner information in the cover letter, but it must be there. There is not a box for owner information in the current NPS 10900 form. So in order for us to know who we legally have to contact, that has to be in the cover letter. If it's not there, the first thing we do is get in touch with the applicant and ask for that information, because we can't even begin the review process until we send out a letter notifying the owner and the applicant that the nomination has been received. We ask for 2 paper copies of the nomination. It doesn't need to be archival paper. Regular printer paper is just fine. 2 color prints of each photograph on paper that's intended for inkjet photo print. So you can go to Photoshop and have them print 2 copies of each print, or you can print it on a color printer as long as you're using the heavy-duty paper that's intended for photo print. It can be matte or glossy, either way is fine. But it's critically important that you also include a CD with the digital images. The minimum resolution for National Register photos is 1200 by 1600 pixels. Recommended is 2000 by 3000 pixels. These days, even a mid-range digital camera or a smartphone will take as good or better resolution photos than these. So it's an easy standard to meet, and you can put plenty of photos on a single CD. And we also ask for the nomination forms themselves, the 10900 forms and their continuation sheets, in Microsoft Word format on the CD. This is an example of over-packaging. This is a little more than is needed. What you see here is a box filled with styrofoam popcorn, and then wrapped in the bubble wrap there is a 3-ring binder with individual Mylar sleeves containing a National Register nomination. We don't require any of that. A binder clip is just fine for submitting the nomination. Maybe an envelope to put the photos in, and a CD sleeve for the CD. We don't require any kind of packaging or binders or other covers for it. We generally end up having to dispose of it because it won't fit into the folders that we use. So minimalism, more is better. It's all about the substance, not the style. The front matter. For the name of a nomination, you want to use the historic name first, and if it's a proper name, the name of a person, then last names first. So the Jane Smith House would be nominated as the Smith, Jane House. For districts with multiple owners, as we said, use the Excel spreadsheet, which is downloadable for our website. Sections 3 and 4 on the front page are blank. And the next item on the second page is the number of resources we want a count, not a description. And for the functions of the property, use Bulletin 16A. This is the front page and the front matter. You'll notice that there's no zip code. The National Register doesn't require a zip code for the property, but we may need it for other purposes, so that should be on the cover letter, as well as your own zip code and the zip code of the property owner. This is the section 5, and you can see here, I'll use the pointer, the numbers of resources. Please use a number here. Sometimes people will actually describe the property. That's not necessarily, we just need to know the count number of contributing and non-contributing resources and the totals. For function or use, these are specific categories that NPS uses in their database. So there is a list of specific functions and specific uses in Bulletin 16A, and essentially you have to take your property and fit it into one of those categories. If all else fails, you can use other, but generally just about any kind of property that you're going to find will fit into one of those categories, even if not perfectly well enough to pass muster. Section 7, the architectural description, starts with an architect classification. Again, Bulletin 16A is the guide here. It's not as well set up for modern architectural styles, so that may be a more general category, or other if necessary. It doesn't include new formalism or postmodern architecture, for example, but you can use a general classification. The narrative description of property should start by summarizing the building. Describe what's there, not the story of the building, not why it was built, not the construction history, but started with physically describing the appearance of the building, what's it made out of, what's its site, what are the materials, roof, walls, windows, doors. And then the greater narrative description expands on that description, including the interior. We've received comments from NPS that often descriptions of the interior of buildings are lacking. So they can be very important, especially for properties for which the interior is part of the character of the property. Construction history should be included in this section, but it should focus on the details of when and how the property was built or modified, not necessarily the history of the building. The discussion of historic integrity ends section 7, and it needs at least a paragraph. If it's a property that has undergone a lot of deterioration, or if it's something that's really needs to be gone into in more detail, then a list of the 7 aspects of integrity and how it meets each is recommended. It's not needed in all applications, especially if the property has a really high degree of integrity, but if integrity is at all in question, it should be addressed in more detail. Section 7, the illustrations here, again, the description starts with the architectural categories, and then materials, and the summary paragraph. Like I said, begin by summarizing very briefly what it is that's being nominated physically. Section 8, significance. Jay is going to go more into how a summary paragraph works, but it also begins with Bulletin 16A. The areas of significance are specific, and NPS wants to see their categories so it can be properly categorized in their database. The period of significance and significant dates is something that it trips a lot of people up, especially if a building is being used through the current day. They'll assume that the period of significance should extend to the current day. This is not the case. A property whose period of significance ends less than 50 years ago has to satisfy criteria consideration G, a higher level of significance. In some cases, it's appropriate for events that happened recently but are of a higher level of significance. But generally, it has to end more than 50 years ago, and a single period of significance, not multiple ones. There are multiple areas of significance. For criterion B, persons or architects, last names first. Cultural affiliation is only for Native American properties. The summary paragraph is key, and then if a property is being nominated under multiple criteria or multiple historic context within a criterion, then each needs a separate narrative statement of significance. But you begin with a summary paragraph that captures all of the areas of significance, the period of significance, and the level of significance, local, state, or national. That level of significance often trips people up. 90% of the properties listed in the National Register are local level of significance, significant to the history of the city or county where located. About 9% are at the state level of significance, where they're influential to the level of the entire state, and only about 1 in 100 reaches the national level of significance, where the events that took place there had nationwide implications. So just because a property didn't have nationwide implications doesn't mean it can't be eligible for the National Register. And the front matter for Section 8 starts with the individual criteria and criteria considerations. And if you're checking any of these criteria considerations, if the property was moved, if it's a religious property, if the period of significance ends less than 50 years ago, then the reasons justifying why the property is still eligible despite those criteria considerations, because this is a list of property types that ordinarily are not eligible for listing, must be addressed in the narrative. As I said, period of significance should be a single span of years. Areas of significance are taken from Bulletin 16A. Significant persons and architects, last name first, and cultural affiliation is for Native American associated properties. Sections 9, 10, and 11. The bibliography should use a standard bibliographical format. That's one thing if you haven't written a history paper in a while, it may require a little bit of brushing up, but a standard bibliography provides all the references that you used, and any project like this is going to involve a lot of references, whether it's reports, whether it's history books, oral histories or interviews, newspaper references, archival materials. They should all be listed, and especially for a nomination that can be a little bit difficult to explain, or one that's more recent in history, making the case for eligibility, it can involve a lot of primary and secondary sources, and you shouldn't short any of them. They should be included in the bibliography. Section 10, mapping. You choose one or the other. You can either use UTMs or decimal degrees to indicate location. If you're using a U.S. Geological Survey map, then you use UTMs. And if you don't have a way to create a Google map, then we still require that you send an actual physical USGS map to our office with the location of the property indicated in pencil, or if it's a district, an outline around the boundary of the property indicated in pencil. And we can calculate the UTMs for you, but we at least need the actual map. You can't just print out a map on a piece of paper and send it in, because it needs to be sized correctly. We still use manual tools and rulers to calculate UTMs. There are also instructions on the National Register page that I showed you earlier on how to create a Google map. I'll show an example of that shortly. And those use decimal degrees rather than UTMs. Decimal degrees are kind of where things are going. They're standard for GIS systems, and while UTMs are accurate to within 10 meters, decimal degrees are accurate to within 6 inches. And another common thing I've seen with people using Google Map is use decimal degrees rather than degrees, minutes, seconds. If you're mapping an area, if the property you're nominating is larger than 10 acres, then you have to draw a box around it with that map. But if it's less than 10 acres or just a single house, a single property, 1 point, either in UTMs or decimal degrees, is sufficient. And it's also important that you include your contact information on the nomination as well as on the cover letter, so we know how to reach you in order to provide you updates on how the nomination is progressing or if we need any information. This is an example of one of those Google Maps. It's mostly just, you can just use Google Earth or Google Maps or Big Maps to create it, and you'll note the property is here. It has a dot on it to indicate its location. I'll grab the arrow. This is the property with a dot. It's named, and it includes the decimal degrees right here. There's a scale, there's a north arrow, and you can see here that this was generated using Google Earth. But this is a good example of what we're looking for. It shows the general surroundings around the property. It's a single point property of about 10 acres, but it shows the nearest road and the entry road to the property, so you get a sense of what's around it. You don't want to zoom out too far where you can't clearly see the resource, but if you zoom in too closely to the point where you can't see any nearby features, it becomes hard to really get a sense of the property from above. And that's the purpose of the map. It also provides the geographic location that National Park Service is going to get about the property. Additional documentation. This includes a photo log accompanying the photos, sketch maps and district maps for large properties or for districts, and then figures and a figure log. It's very important that modern photos are entirely separate from historic photos. And it can be very useful to compare a modern photo to a historic photo. And people will sometimes, photo 1 is a modern photo of the property, photo 2 is a historic photo of the same property. The problem is that those should be separate. You can refer to them in the narrative. You can say, see photo 1, see figure 2, in order to provide that comparison. But the photos of the property are all that, what we mean by that are contemporary photos taken recently to show how it looks now. Historic photos are figures. And that includes pictures of people or individual artworks or newspaper articles. This is an example of a photo log. It's a little bit small, but it can be a good thing to review because it shows not only the number of photos, but also how the photos are named. There's the name of each photo in here, and the NPS format for naming the digital file is a little bit obtuse, but once you figure it out, it's pretty straightforward. It includes the name of the photographer, when the photos were taken, and then there's a very brief description of what's in each photograph. You don't need a whole lot of detail for the photo log, but just enough to get a sense to include the information that is required in Bulletin 16A. All that needs to be on the photo itself is the name of the property, its state and county, and the photo number, which should correspond to what's on the digital file. So photo 1 in your stack of physical photos should correspond to photo 0001 on the CDR. This is an example of a figure log. All the figures should be pasted into the nomination document on continuation sheets. As you can see here, there's a historic print of the property. There's an advertisement. These are very useful to give a sense to the reader of the significance of the property and how it looked in the past, how it was perceived, but it should be separate in the end of the nomination, and you can refer to them again using notes. This is another use of a figure log to show maps. This is a small district, and one key point here that almost caused a problem is you'll note that this person used color to indicate contributors in blue and non-contributors in red. The problem is when we copy these nominations on archival paper to send to NPS, they're copied in black and white, so any color is lost, and I actually considered asking the person to change this around in order to make it clear what was a contributor and what was not. But we photocopied it, but because the blue pattern is darker than the red pattern, it was obvious which ones were contributors and which ones were not. And you can see here that the applicant used the address of the properties for each building to indicate which one was which, but you can also number them. And that numbering scheme should correspond to the description of the properties in the district in section 7 of the nomination. And here you can see another note you'll see here, the small numbers here correspond to photos. People very often will create a photo map so they have an explicit guide to where each photo submitted with the nomination was taken. It's not required, but it's often a very helpful guide for reviewers so we can see get a clearer sense using a map where each photo was taken and what building we're looking at. That helps avoid confusion. But it's really helpful for districts or large properties where it may not be clear where a photo was taken from, but it's not required. And then the actual nomination process itself, we log it in and staff review it. We do the technical review. We look over to things like description and significance. If we need information, we'll ask you for it. Once the final draft is prepared, then it's scheduled for a meeting of the State Historical Resources Commission. That happens every 90 days, generally in Sacramento currently, and then in the spring, the meeting is held in conjunction with California Preservation Foundation. This year it's going to be in San Diego. We post the nominations 60 days in advance and send notices to the property owner, to the applicant, to the city government, if there is one, and to the county government. And if it's a certified local government, we also send a letter to that CLG contact, so the local preservation director or the preservation commission. We prepare a staff report and submit it to our commissioners. And in the case of the California Register, properties, if the commission votes to approve the California Register nomination, it's immediately listed in the California Register as soon as the chair signs it. Landmarks and points are listed after the chair after the chair and also the director of state parks sign them. In the case of National Register, they're signed after the meeting by the state historic preservation officer, and then we send them to National Park Service. That generally takes about 45 days, and only once the nomination has been approved by the keeper of the National Register and formally listed, then it becomes formally listed in the National Register and automatically added to the California Register. And if a nomination is opposed by a property owner and so it receives a determination of eligibility from National Park Service on the basis of opposition, it will still be automatically added to the California Register because it results in a determination of eligibility for listing. And now I'll turn back over to Jay.
This will only take a few minutes, and I wanted to go a little bit into writing good summary statements of significance because they are so critical. And just as the amount of packaging is usually inversely proportional to the quality of the nomination, the quality of the summary statement of significance is also proportionally related to the quality of the nomination. I contend that if you write a really strong summary statement of significance and use that as your thesis statement or your launching point for the significance section of the nomination, you will go a long ways towards preparing a good document. I intentionally just took a shot of the page of the bulletin because when I'm discussing summary statements of significance on the telephone. I wish so much often that I could just show the language in the bulletin. We ask that you use the language in the bulletin. So I'm going to try to give some examples. Under criterion event, properties can be eligible for the National Register if they are associated with the events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. So if you were nominating a large factory building in Oakland, California, for example, we would want to see the light bulb factory is significant under National Register Criterion A because it's associated with the development of manufacturing in Oakland, California. And then, as I discussed earlier, you would have to describe a little bit about that manufacturing history of the community, and then describe how this particular building played a role in that manufacturing history. And I just pulled that example out of a hat off the top of my head. We recently processed a nomination for that building, and it's a good nomination. I do frequently have to make slight adjustments, though. For example, if things are, if the context statement is too narrow, and I'll give you an example. This building is eligible for its role in light bulb manufacturing in Oakland. Well, that happened to be the only building that was involved in light bulb manufacturing. So I think that that could be considered too narrow. There really isn't a context there, or much of a context. So, I ask that it be broadened out to manufacturing in general in the locale. So I will just emphasize, try not to use, other language. Properties can be eligible because it was important in American history. Really try to focus on the language there in the header of the bulletin. Don't repeat the general language back to us. Don't write what you see there. We don't need to see the bulletin, the exact bulletin language. Just insert your context and your property name, but using that sentence that I have illustrated in front of you. So we'll move on to criterion C, and you'll see that that's a little longer. Criterion C, I think probably the majority of our nominations are for criterion C, design construction. This is the architecture criterion, but this is probably the criterion that drifts the most, though, too. This property is eligible because it's a good example of Gothic architecture. I think that frequently those nominations start off bad. They're not exacting enough, and they require the most editing. So my contention is if you closely follow this language, properties, this building is eligible for the National Register because it embodies the distinctive characteristics of Italianate architecture. And then describe what Italianate architecture is, and then how this particular building embodies the distinctive characteristics of that type of architecture. So if any of you have telephoned me, you've heard me say the same thing. This really is the heart, it's the meat of the nomination, and so I can't overemphasize how critical it is to follow this little bit of instruction that I'm giving you right now. So there are other aspects of criterion C, but I'll conclude with just focusing on the architectural style. So I think Williams already mentioned it, but I'll just emphasize it again, that the nomination process is collaborative. Although we don't write them, we do heavily edit the nominations. We're here to help. We were just discussing this morning in the registration unit that there's about 3 different ways we edit. One is by writing a very lengthy request for further information. It takes a lot of time, hours and hours, even days of effort to craft a well-written letter asking you to make changes in a large document. I have frequently used just marking up the nomination in red and running it through our PDF copier and then sending that to you. It's very informal, but it's much quicker and efficient. And then the other way, of course, would be just to use track changes, which I don't think any of us really care for a whole lot. Amy Crane in the registration unit and I both have just used a strike through in language that is not correct or inadequate, and then write in red what we'd rather see in the document. So that's all I have for now. We can turn it over to question and answer unless William wants to add anything to what he said. So,
no, we're open to people's questions.
Okay, so we have a full 15 minutes for questions, and I haven't seen any come in yet. So what I'm gonna do is open it up, have people ask their questions. Please do so either through the Q&A box or the chat box. If you'd really like to have your microphone enabled, if you're attached to a microphone, I can enable you. You would have to raise your hand using the symbol at the top of the screen, though. While I was just saying that, a question came in from Maggie, and she was asking, did William say that a resource can be listed on the National Register even when it's only locally or state level significant?
Yes.
I thought the local and okay, yes. I thought the local and state designations were designed for those nominations that didn't make the national significance cut.
I'd like to add. I mean, it's such an important question, and I think some of the more, although we rarely have contentious discussions on the telephone, some of the more interesting debates are with folks who really insist that their property is significant at the national level of significance. And recently, I've had a consultant in the southern part of the state express to me her dismay at how a property could be eligible for the National Register if it wasn't significant at the National Register. So it's so important that everyone realize that the National Register has 3 levels of significance: local, state, and national. And the vast majority of resources are significant at the local level. I use that as an example to illustrate how I think most downtown buildings in a small town in California could be shown to be significant at the local level. Every bank probably played a significant level in a small town, a significant role, every hardware store. In order to prove national level of significance, you have to show how that resource influenced history across the entire land. So you can see that proving national level of significance would be extremely difficult. So a lighthouse, for example, it was built by the national government. Lighthouses played an important role nationally, but did this particular lighthouse influence history across the land? Probably not. So if you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I think people commonly will assume that local and state programs are less rigorous than the National Register. Part of the issue is the fact that there are some states that don't program, and there are many cities that don't have a local program. So the National Register is intended to capture all levels of properties, and as I said, 90% of properties listed in the National Register are locally significant. Another thing to note is that the ways that local governments administer their local lists varies widely, and in some cases they are more stringent than the National Register. Properties in some cities have to be 75 years or older rather than 50 years or older, or they have to be eligible under 2 criteria. So the National Register is intended to be a national list, but it's definitely open to properties that are locally significant rather than at the level of state or national.
And you made me think of something. One of the most basic things we haven't mentioned is that the most basic criteria, although there are exceptions, is that properties be 50 years of age before they be nominated to the National Register. I can't remember if either one of us mentioned that today. So there are exceptions, but the basic cutoff is 50 years of age.
Looks like we've got a few more questions.
And on that note, you may be seeing these questions as well, but one of the questions that came up while you were discussing that was about resources that are newer. A question from Lori says, how are you addressing resources dating to the mid-century modern era? Do you feel there are some good context statements that have been developed which can be used as guides, and not just for buildings but cultural landscapes?
Well, the mid-century modern era, if we're talking about architecture, 50 years ago is 1965, so that's well into the era of mid-century architecture. If a building is newer than that, then it has to meet the standard of exceptional significance, and there are properties that have. The other issue in terms of, well, cultural landscapes is kind of a more complex issue because there really, I mean, there really aren't any mid-century cultural landscapes that I'm aware of. Typically, cultural landscapes is more used within the context of traditional cultural practices that, rather than contemporary architecture or recent history.
There are
Okay.
sample nominations for modern resources, and there are context statements for modern resources.
All right, and perhaps I can gather some of these resources and examples for people after the session is over. Um, Diane is asking, can the presenters discuss setting boundaries and also adding contributors and non-contributors, I'm guessing, to a district?
Boundaries are dependent largely on historic context and integrity. And there is a specific guide for setting boundaries in National Register districts. It's available through the NPS website that you linked earlier. In fact, there are a lot of specialized bulletins that are useful for special circumstances, for cemeteries, for naval craft, for archaeological districts, for traditional cultural properties and cultural landscapes. Uh, and boundaries can be kind of a fuzzy thing because they're often not obvious and they're subject to a great level of interpretation.
Okay, and another question was about the standard format for the bibliography style. I guess there's multiple style guides out there, whether it's the Chicago Manual or the APA. Is there any preferred bibliographical style that is typically used?
There isn't a standard style, but we ask that you use one.
Okay, so it could be any kind or any style type. It's just um, as long as you're using one that's
I think
pretty
so.
accepted.
Clear.
Uh, okay, okay, great. And I think you mentioned oral histories and things like that are perfectly acceptable as sources.
Especially with more contemporary resources, they can be a key issue. They can be a really important way to capture information that doesn't get recorded anywhere else. So yes, definitely.
Okay. I don't see any further questions. Please, we still have about 7 minutes, so we have plenty of time to address any further questions if anybody has any. Of course, if you think of anything after the session is over, um, I can either forward them to William and Jay. Did you have a question?
There was also the item about contributing and non-contributing resources, and typically if there's a resource, if there's a district or a property with several resources within it. One of the things that you have to look at is, are all the properties within this boundary all equally eligible, or were some of them constructed later? Have some of them lost historic integrity? And if they have been damaged or altered to the point where they no longer convey their significance, or they're more recent than the end of the period of significance, then they're considered non-contributors. And there isn't a strict ratio of contributors to non-contributors that we're looking for. It's more about the overall picture and the general sense of the property. So a district that has a few buildings that have been demolished and new buildings added to the area doesn't necessarily mean the district isn't eligible if the overall sense you get conveys that significance.
Okay. What about removing items from the National Register? Does that ever happen? Say something has lost its integrity, or a building is no longer there.
I've dealt a little bit with some removals, so I'll take it. We like to say that you have to unwind the process in the same way that the process took place. So you would have to submit documentation to us demonstrating that the property no longer retains the characteristics that enabled it to meet National Register criteria in the first place. That's, I would say, the main substantive reason a property would be removed. We would have to take that documentation before the State Historical Resources Commission to get their recommendation to forward it to the keeper. There are a few very, very narrow ways to remove properties from the National Register, which are primarily technical in nature. You would have to show that there was a procedural error or that the new information comes to light to show that the property never was eligible. I hope that our review process, though, would eliminate that from happening. It's very infrequent. I think in the 7 years that I've been here, we've removed 2 properties, maybe 3. So, and we list 45 a year approximately.
I think one was a property that had burned down.
That's right.
And the other was a railroad car that was nominated along with a passenger depot, and the railroad car didn't actually have any association with that passenger depot. It was placed there by a museum group after the end of
Okay.
the cruise.
All right. Another question came in to asking to discuss integrity. And Diane is saying the National Register Bulletin says a majority of character-defining features. How is that interpreted by National Register reviewers?
It's not really a majority. There needs to be enough, and it's one of those things. It's really it is a matter of opinion, and in some cases it's very subjective. It depends on the property, and as Jay mentioned, it depends on the criteria under which the property is being nominated. Property being nominated for criterion A or B, there's a lower threshold of significance than under criterion C, where a lot of the property's significance has to do with the architecture, with the specific materials, and with the workmanship exhibited in the property.
It's my, I could be wrong, but it's my observation that discussions of integrity seem to be very intense 20 years ago and even 10 years ago. But we rarely encounter controversy or disagreement over integrity. We really almost never, actually maybe once or twice in 7 years, have we had a property rejected by the keeper of the National Register because of a lack of integrity. So a property does need to, of course, it needs to have integrity, but I don't see it as a complicated, fuzzy issue. I think that maybe some people saw it as several years in the past. That's just my professional opinion.
Okay, and a question came in about the recording. Of course, I will. I'll try to remember to email everybody a link to the recording when it's available. It should be available by tomorrow if all goes well on transferring it over. And the PDF is currently available. If you go to the registration page, oh, and I see you also brought up your contact information, so feel free to use these contacts if you have any questions. But the PDF is online now. If you go either to the registration page or click on the link that I pasted into the chat box or the Q&A box, you should find it there. Just a reminder that this is only the second part of a 4-part quarterly series. Part 3 will cover Section 106, and Part 4 will look at the California Historical, is it the CRIS, Resource Information System, if I'm reading out that acronym right. So feel free to register for them. Even if you haven't registered for them yet, they're still available for registration online. And we really appreciate your support and your interest. This is a great program, a new program for CPF. And I wanted to thank each of the speakers as well as the SHPO for helping organize this. What I'm going to do now, if there are no further questions, I'll keep a close eye on this for about 20-30 seconds just to see if anybody has any final questions. I'm going to move over to the evaluation page in a second here, and I really encourage you to let us know how we did today, and offer suggestions and advice on future workshops or programs that you'd like to see CPF do, and we'll do what we can to include them in the program in the future. And also encourage you to become a member. Through your membership, you support us, you support our education program, and it's really not that much, and you get a lot out of it. So feel free to ask me or visit CPF, californiapreservation.org, to learn more about membership. Thank you, William, and thank you, Jay. And I'm going to move over to the evaluation page right now. Please hang around and type in your responses in the evaluation. And have a great rest of the day. It's a little foggy over here